All right, so you're ready to tackle NFS and SMB for your Proxmox or Unraid server. We're diving deep into a comparison document that you've got breaking down these file sharing protocols so you can pick the best one for your setup. It can really feel like a tech showdown, NFS versus SMB, but don't worry, we'll decode all the jargon, and by the end, you'll be the judge.
Yeah, what's intriguing here is that both of these protocols are designed for sharing files between computers.
Hmm.
But they go about it in very different ways, each with its own strengths and its own quirks. It's like choosing between a sports car and an SUV. Both can get you where you need to go, but the ride is totally different.
I love that analogy. Okay, so just for some quick context, Proxmox and Unraid are popular for managing virtual machines and containers, right?
Think of them like virtual apartment buildings for your software. And these file sharing protocols are the elevators and the hallways that let your data move around smoothly.
Perfect. Let's start with NFS, often called the UNIX workhorse. Why that nickname?
Well, it goes back to the 1980s when NFS was created for sharing files between UNX systems. And because Linux, the foundation of both Proxmox and Unraid, has its roots in UNIX, NFS just fits right in. It's like they speak the same native language.
So does that mean NFS is the speed demon for Proxmox and Unraid?
In many cases, yes. One of the big reasons is its low overhead. Think of overhead as the administrative tasks involved in moving data around. NFS keeps those tasks minimal, making it super efficient, especially in a Linux-only setup.
Okay, so less paperwork for the data, which means faster travel times.
Precisely. But even our speedy friend NFS has a quirk, something called stale file handles.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
It's not a deal breaker, but it can be annoying. Imagine you're working on a file that is stored on your Unraid server via NFS, and your network connection hiccups for even a second. Suddenly, NFS can't find the file's handle its location, and you might get locked out. It's like the file just suddenly vanished.
That would be incredibly frustrating, especially if you're in the middle of something important.
Exactly. You would have to remount the share to get access again, which can disrupt your workflow. It's definitely something to keep in mind when considering NFS.
Noted. So NFS is fast and efficient for Linux setups, but has this potential connection quirk. Got it. Now what about SMB, the cross-platform champion? Why does it have that title?
Well, SMB started as a Microsoft creation, primarily for Windows. But over time, it's become compatible with pretty much every operating system out there, including macOS and, importantly, Linux. That makes it ideal if you have a mix of devices on your network.
So if I'm sharing files between my Windows PC and my Proxmox server, SMB would be the way to go.
Absolutely. And what's particularly interesting is the evolution of SMB. Specifically, SMB 3.0 and later versions has significantly improved security with features like encryption, which scrambles your data during transfer, and multi-channel support, which allows for multiple simultaneous connections for faster and more reliable file transfers.
So SMB has upped its security game considerably. What are some of the trade-offs for that cross-platform compatibility and security?
Well, while SMB can certainly hold its own in terms of speed, in a pure Linux-to-Linux environment, that might not be as lightning fast as NFS. There's a bit more overhead involved because it has to translate between different systems, which can add a tiny bit of lag. It's like taking a slightly longer route with more scenic views.
Okay, so NFS might have a slight edge in speed for Linux-only setups. What about ease of use? Which one is easier to configure?
For basic setups on Linux, NFS generally takes the cake for simplicity. It's relatively straightforward to configure, especially if you're comfortable with the command line. But when you start adding Windows clients or need more fine-grained control over things like permissions, SMB can get a bit more complex, even with tools like Samba to help you out.
So NFS is like the quick and easy setup, while SMB gives you more control but might require a bit more tinkering.
Got it. Now that we have a sense of their personalities, can we compare them head-to-head? All right, so we've got NFS, the streamlined Linux speedster, and SMB, the cross-platform all-rounder with enhanced security. Let's put them head-to-head and compare some key features in more detail, starting with performance. Is it always a landslide victory for NFS?
Well, in a Linux-only world, NFS often has the edge because it's so tightly integrated with the Linux kernel, the heart of the operating system. It's like having a direct line to the control center, so things happen quickly.
But you mentioned earlier that SMB can hold its own right. What makes it competitive?
SMB has come a long way, especially with those later versions. With features like multi-channel support, it can use multiple network connections simultaneously, which can boost performance significantly. Think of it like having multiple lanes on a highway. The data has more room to flow freely. So even though NFS might have a slight speed advantage in pure Linux environments, SMB can still keep up, especially with the right tuning. What about when we factor in Windows?
That's where SMB really shines. It's specifically designed to work seamlessly with Windows. So if you have a mix of Windows and Linux machines, SMB is often the smoother, faster choice.
Okay, so performance depends on the specific setup and operating systems involved.
Got it. Let's move on to security. We touched on SMB's improvements, but what are the key differences between NFS and SMB in this area?
This is where things get really interesting. NFS by default relies more on external security measures like firewalls and VPNs to protect data during transfer. It's not that it's inherently insecure, but it assumes you have other safeguards in place.
So it's like NFS is saying, hey, I'm fast and efficient, but I trust you to handle the security details.
Exactly. Now, older versions of SMB, particularly SMB1, had some well-documented security vulnerabilities, but that's why it's crucial to use SMB 3.0 or later. These versions have made huge strides with features like encryption and stronger authentication protocols, making them much more robust. So it's like SMB decided to invest in a top-notch security system to protect its valuable data.
Precisely. And that makes it a much more compelling choice for environments where security is paramount.
Makes sense. Okay, what about ease of setup? We talked about NFS being relatively simple for basic configurations. How does SMB compare?
For basic file sharing between Linux machines, NFS is usually the quicker setup. But when you start introducing Windows clients, things can get a bit trickier with SMB. Configuring permissions and user authentication across different operating systems can require some extra steps and knowledge, even with helpful tools like Samba.
So it's a trade-off. The simplicity of NFS for basic Linux setups versus the flexibility and control of SMB for more complex or mixed environments. What about file locking? Is that something to consider?
Absolutely. File locking is crucial when you have multiple users accessing the same file simultaneously. You don't want them overwriting each other's changes and corrupting data.
So it's like having a traffic light system for file access, ensuring that only one person can edit a file at a time.
Exactly. Now, both NFS and SMB offer file locking mechanisms.
Yeah.
But SMB generally provides more robust and granular control, especially in those collaborative environments where data integrity is paramount.
Interesting. So if you're working with shared files that require tight control over access and editing, SMB might have the upper hand in that department. What about permissions? How do they differ between NFS and SMB?
Permissions are all about controlling who can access what files and folders. NFS uses the traditional UNIX-style permission system, which is familiar to Linux users and quite straightforward. You've got your user group and other permissions, and you can set read, write, and execute permissions for each. It's clean, logical, and efficient.
So NFS keeps it simple and in line with its overall philosophy of speed and efficiency. What about SMB?
SMB uses a system called Access Control Lists, or ACLs, which is the standard in the Windows world. ACLs are incredibly powerful and flexible, allowing for granular control over permissions. You can specify exactly who has access to what, down to the individual user or group level, but that flexibility comes at a price that can be quite complex to manage, especially for those used to the simplicity of the UNIX permissions model.
So it's like choosing between a classic key lock and a high-tech digital lock system. The key lock is straightforward and easy to use, while the digital lock offers more options and control, but might require a bit more expertise to manage.
That's a great analogy. It really captures the essence of the difference between NFS and SMB permissions.
Okay, so we've covered performance, security setup, file locking, and permissions. Quite a comprehensive comparison. What about best practices for optimizing each of these protocols, particularly for Proxmox and Unraid?
That's where things get really hands-on. Let's start with NFS. One of the most impactful things you can do is tweak your mount options. These are special settings that control how your NFS share is mounted or connected to your Proxmox or Unraid server.
So it's like fine-tuning the engine of your NFS race car to get the best performance out of it.
Exactly. There are a few key mount options to consider. One is called async, which tells the system not to wait for confirmation from the server before proceeding with writes. It's like sending a text message and not waiting for a reply before moving on to your next task.
So it speeds things up by not getting bogged down with acknowledgments for every tiny bit of data.
Precisely. Another useful option is no time, which disables the recording of file access times. This reduces disk activity and can improve performance, especially for tasks that involve a lot of reading data.
Less bookkeeping, more action. Are there any other mount options we should be aware of?
Absolutely. Terra's size and size are two more important ones. These control the size of data blocks used for reading and writing. Tuning these values can optimize transfer speeds based on your network conditions and the types of files you're sharing.
So it's about finding the sweet spot for your specific setup, like adjusting the tire pressure on your race car for optimal grip on the track.
You got it. Experimenting with these mount options can make a noticeable difference in your NFS performance. But beyond tweaking settings, What else can we do to ensure a smooth NFS experience?
Well, you mentioned earlier the importance of network stability, especially with those pesky, stale file handle errors. Is that something we can actively improve?
Absolutely. A stable and reliable network connection is crucial for NFS. Investing in a good router, ensuring your network cables are in top shape, and minimizing any sources of network interference can go a long way in preventing those frustrating disconnections.
So it's like paving a smooth road for our NFS data to travel on. Fewer bumps, fewer delays.
Exactly. And finally, don't overlook access restrictions. You want to make sure that only authorized devices and users can access your NFS shares.
Security first. How do we lock things down on the NFS side?
On your NFS server, you can use a file called sexports to define which clients are allowed to connect to which shares. You can specify IP addresses or host names to control access with a high level of precision. It's like having a guest list for your file server. Only those on the list get in.
Great advice. So for NFS, it's all about optimizing mount options, ensuring network stability, and locking things down with access restrictions. Now let's switch gears and talk about best practices for SMB on Proxmox and Unraid. What are the top tips for getting the most out of SMB in these environments?
The most fundamental advice for SMB is to make absolutely sure you're using the latest version available, preferably SMB 3.0 or later. We've already discussed the security concerns with older versions like SMB 1, so upgrading is paramount.
Right. It's like upgrading your home security system from a simple padlock to a state-of-the-art alarm system with motion sensors and cameras. What about encryption? Is that a must-have for SMB?
If security is a top priority, then yeah, enabling SMB encryption is absolutely essential. It adds that extra layer of protection by scrambling your data as it travels across the network. So even if someone intercepts it, they can't read it without the decryption key.
So it's like putting your confidential files in a locked briefcase before sending them across town.
Precisely. Encryption gives you that peace of mind, especially if you're dealing with sensitive data. Are there any other SMB-specific tips we should keep in mind for Proxmox and Unraid?
You bet. Don't forget about Samba. It's a powerful suite of tools specifically designed for managing SMB on Linux systems.
Ah, yes, Samba. It's like having a bilingual translator for your file server, enabling smooth communication between your Linux servers and any Windows clients on your network.
Exactly. Samba gives you granular control over user authentication share permissions and a host of other settings, allowing you to fine-tune your SMB setup for optimal performance and compatibility.
It's a must-have for anyone serious about using SMB in a Linux environment. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the strengths and weaknesses of each protocol to specific optimization tips for Proxmox and Unraid. But now for the big question. How do we choose the right protocol for our specific setup?
Right, because at the end of the day, it's all about making the best decision for your individual needs. There's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
Exactly. The best protocol depends entirely on your specific requirements, the operating systems you're using, your performance expectations, your security concerns, and your level of comfort with technical configurations.
So it's like choosing the right tool for the job. A screwdriver screws a hammer for nails. You wouldn't use a hammer to try to screw in a light bulb, would you?
Precisely. You need to assess your environment, your needs, and your priorities. To help guide your decision, let's revisit those key questions we touched on earlier. First, what operating systems are you using?
If it's all Linux, NFS might seem like the obvious choice, right?
It often is, especially if speed and simplicity are your top priorities. But even in a Linux-only environment, if you anticipate adding Windows machines down the line or require advanced features like encryption SMB, might be a better long-term strategy.
So think ahead. Don't just consider your current setup, but also how your needs might evolve in the future. What's the next key question?
How important is speed to you? Are you running applications that demand lightning-fast file access, like high-performance computing or video editing, or is it more about general file sharing and storage?
If speed is paramount and it's all Linux to Linux communication, NFS often has that slight edge. But we've also seen that SMB has made significant strides in performance, especially with those later versions.
Exactly. With the right tuning, SMB can often keep up with NFS, even for demanding tasks. Don't rule it out entirely based solely on speed. And finally, the third crucial question. How much emphasis are you placing on security? Are you dealing with sensitive data that needs to be protected at all costs?
If security is non-negotiable, then SMB 3.0 or later with encryption enabled should be at the top of your list. Those advanced security features can make a world of difference in safeguarding your valuable data.
Absolutely. So there you have it, 3 key questions to guide your decision. Operating systems, the importance of speed, and the emphasis on security. By carefully considering these factors in the context of your specific needs and setup, you can narrow down your choices and select the protocol that best aligns with your priorities.
And remember, it's not a life sentence. You can always switch protocols down the road if your needs change or you find that one isn't quite meeting your expectations.
Exactly. The beauty of technology is that it's constantly evolving, and we have options. Speaking of options, I think it's worth mentioning that NFS and SMB aren't the only protocols out there. There are others, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, that might be a better fit for certain specialized use cases.
That's a great point. We've focused on NFS and SMB because they're particularly relevant for Proxmox and Unraid. But it's always good to explore the wider landscape of possibilities. For instance, there's ISCSI, which is often used for connecting servers to high-performance storage networks, or GlusterFS, which excels at creating large distributed file systems.
Exactly. The key is to be curious, to research, to experiment, and to find the solution that truly fits your needs, even if it's outside the mainstream. And that's what the deep dive is all about, encouraging exploration, critical thinking, and a thirst for knowledge.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into NFS and SMB, what's the one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with?
I think the most important message is this. Don't be afraid to dive in, to learn, and to make informed decisions based on your individual needs. There's no right or wrong answer, only the best solution for your specific situation. And remember, the journey of learning and exploring is just as rewarding as the destination.
Couldn't have said it better myself. You've got the knowledge, the resources, and hopefully the confidence to choose the file sharing protocol that's right for you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, happy file sharing.